Today I'm going to be making some traditional English mince pies. In case you don't know what mince pies are, the modern version is a sweet pastry crust filled with the mixture of sweetened and spiced dried fruits. The naming of mince pies sometimes causes a bit of confusion because mincemeat, which is the filling, sounds like it has meat in it. And mincemeat is also the name that we give to ground beef or something like that. So minced beef, mincemeat, why are they called such similar things? You may have heard people say that historically mince pies used to contain meat. And you may have heard other people say, yes, but back in those days they used to use the word meat to talk about any kind of solid food. So it probably didn't mean that mince pies had meat in them. Well, yes, but also no, because mince pies did have meat in them. We're just going to go over to Studio Shrimp to talk about the recipe that kind of inspired this. So this is a copy of the recipe I want us to look at today. This was written in 1624, so 400 years old this year. And this is from the Conway Papers. We very nearly didn't have this document at all, actually. It survived by luck and good judgment. There's a really interesting story behind that, but it's a bit of a sidetrack. So I'll put a link in the description about how this document was almost lost to us by being used to light a fire. Anyway, this is a recipe for 6 minced pies of an indifferent bigness. I think that's possibly the best title for a recipe I've ever seen. And this is from 1624, so 400 years old. It's not by any means the oldest recipe for mince pies that we have. There are recorded recipes going back all the way to 13-something for what was then called tarts of flesh, which have pretty much the same recipe, a mixture of meat and dried fruits and spices in a pie case, establishing, I think, pretty definitively that mince pies used to have minced meat in them. Anyway, this recipe says, take half a peck of the finest flour, 2 pounds of sugar, 2 pounds of butter, a loin of fat mutton with a little leg of veal to mince with it, 2 pounds of raisins of the sun, that's sun-dried raisins I think, as many currants, so another 2 pounds of currants, of cloves, mace and nutmegs, 1 ounce. For the paste, mingle 1 pound and a half of sugar with the flour and break in the yolks of 6 eggs. Then work it together with 3 parts of the 2 pounds of butter. Set on a little water and let it seethe. Then skim it and put on the 4th part of the butter, and when it is melted, skim it clean from the water and work it with the paste. So I'm not quite sure whether this is a recipe for like a hot water crust pastry, which would have been common back in those days. Hot water crust is the crust that we now associate with pork pies, and it's a crispy and fatty pastry. And historically, in the days before refrigeration, it would have been used partly as a way of preserving a pie. You would encase some spiced and seasoned meat inside a hard pastry shell, and the top might be sealed with fat or with gelatin and more pastry, and that would preserve it for days, perhaps weeks, in a cold larder rather than what we do now, which is put it in the fridge. So yeah, it could be a hot water crust pastry. It might not be. It might be talking about clarifying the butter. It's really not that clear. For the meat, let it be seasoned with pepper and mingled with half a pound of sugar, the other fruit and spice. The raisins must be stoned, and some of them minced amongst the meat. The others put in whole. Put in the juice of 2 oranges and 1 lemon, and the rind of them small minced. When the pies are filled, slice dates and stick in the top, and when you set them in the oven, wash them over with the yolks of eggs and pin them up in papers. It's unclear how much meat is in here, but it's a loin of mutton and a bit of a leg of veal. The amounts are not very specific, but I'm going to assume that that's about 50% meat, 50% of the fruity, spicy mix. I'm not going to stick exactly to this recipe because I want a few different fruits in here. This one's only got raisins and currants. I want to have a few other things in there. But I'm going to make something that's in the spirit of this recipe. So it is going to be a meaty, fruity, spicy mince pie. This is my mincemeat. I made this last night. And so this is a mixture of meat plus dried fruits, nuts, spices, and citrus fruits. In fact, let's go back to yesterday's shrimp and have a look at how this is made. So these are most of the ingredients for the filling for our mince pies. So what we got here is 100 grams of brown sugar, 100 grams of raisins. These are seedless raisins. The original recipe says stoned raisins because back in those days, raisins would have had seeds in them, and stoned raisins would have had the seeds taken out laboriously by hand. 100 grams of currants. Bit of confusion about currants. Currants are dried red grapes, not black currants or red currants. They are just a different kind of raisin, essentially. much smaller. Often they have little crunchy seeds in them. These don't. These are seedless ones by the look of it. But different flavour to raisins. Sort of richer and more complex flavour than raisins. We've got 100 grams of dried figs, 100 grams of dates, and 100 grams of walnuts. And then we're going to have the juice and zest of 1 orange, and the zest plus half the juice of 1 lemon. And then spices, about half a teaspoonful each of nutmeg, mace, cloves, and black pepper, and a pinch of salt. I did say nearly all the ingredients because there's also going to be 300 grams of minced lamb. This is 20% fat minced lamb, so I won't be adding any suet to this. The fat is in the meat already. Right, let's get making mincemeat. These dates don't go on until the last minute. When the pies are filled, we chop up the dates and put them on top of the filling in a pie. Not sure why, but we'll hopefully find out. Food processor, because whilst we are making a recipe in the style of something from 400 years ago, we don't have to pretend that we live there. The big ingredients go in first, so the figs and the walnuts. And I'll just get those chopped down into smaller pieces before we put the other smaller things in. Right, now that the nuts are cut into small pieces, the raisins can go in. The old recipe does talk about cutting in half some of the raisins, so we're going to be doing that, but just not individually by raisin. Okay, that should hopefully have opened up some of those raisins and let some of the flavour out of them. Now, everything else goes in there, but I'm just going to pulse it a couple of times to mix it. So the brown sugar, this is unrefined sugar, the currants, the spices, so pepper, cloves, nutmeg, mace. It's interesting it's got nutmeg and mace, because nutmeg and mace are very similar flavours because they're different parts of the same spice. Also, in now goes the salt. I think the lemon zest I might as well just do straight in there. This is an unwaxed lemon, so actually it's really interesting how much firmer this is than a waxed lemon. I suppose it just has had to be brought to market that much quicker to keep fresh, and it's just interesting how that does smell like a fresher lemon. So that's all of the zest of that lemon, but we're only going to have half the juice. And then you can't get unwaxed oranges, so I've given this one a scrub with some hot water, and hopefully that'll be good enough. So the zest of the orange. Oh, make sure we don't drop that bit in, that's the little stalk. This juicer is really meant for lemons, so I have to cut oranges a bit smaller to get them in there. And people often ask me about this juicer. All I know is I bought it in a charity shop. It's made in Italy, and it has Simplex 1 written on it somewhere. I think it's possibly about as old as I am. Okay, and just the juice of half the lemon. Good. That juice is going to go in the food processor too. So the juice is in there, and now the meat. There we go, that's 300 grams of lamb in there. Now, you may be shocked and or surprised that this is not being cooked before it goes inside the pies, but the pies are going to be baked until the filling is boiling hot, and so the meat gets cooked inside the pies. It doesn't get browned outside of the pies at all. The only browning that will take place here is the browning of the crust. Right, that's all that needs. I just wanted to bring that into a homogeneous mixture, really. I don't want to shred it to a fine paste. But that is our meat-based mincemeat. That now needs to go in the fridge overnight, and I suspect there's going to be, to some extent, the lemon juice is going to cook the lamb a little bit, chemically cook the lamb, a bit like ceviche. So meat-based mincemeat now needs to go into a covered dish and in the fridge overnight. The 17th century, they wouldn't have had fridges, so this probably would have gone in a cold larder or something. Anyway, see you tomorrow. So that was the mincemeat, and that's been sitting in the fridge overnight. And so essentially the lamb that's in there has been marinating in the sugar, the fruits, the spices, the citrus. So yeah, we're essentially going to be making something that's a marinated lamb pie, but it's a sweet version and really, really heavily marinated. Anyway, as I say, that's the mince. We now need to make the pastry. 100 grams of brown sugar. And for that, I've got 400 grams of plain flour, 200 grams of wholemeal flour, 100 grams of brown sugar. And I'm also going to be using lard and butter in the short crust pastry. So 150 grams each of lard and butter, 2 egg yolks. Yes, they really are that colour. Burford Browns, my favourite eggs. It's going to be a sweet short crust pastry, so it does need a little bit of water to bring it together. And for that, I've infused my water with a generous pinch of saffron. The separated egg whites will not go to waste. That will appear in some other recipe later on. Probably not in this series, but anyway, that'll be in maybe my almond cake recipe. Anyway, let's make the pastry. I'm going to be using a food processor to make the pastry. If you don't have one of these, you could rub the fat into the flour by hand using a standard short crust method. But since I have a food processor, I'm going to use it. So, plain flour, wholemeal flour. Now the reason I'm using a mixture of plain and wholemeal is to try to get closer to what might have been the flour that would have been used in olden times. It would not have been so refined as the flour we use today, probably. And the same with the brown sugar. The recipe doesn't specify brown sugar, it just says sugar, but the sugar 400 years ago would have been less refined, and so it would have been a bit like brown sugar, even though this particular kind of brown sugar is made by adding molasses back to white sugar. Still similar flavour profile. 150 grams each of butter and lard. Normally a pastry recipe would specify a pinch of salt, but I'm using salted butter, so the salt's in there. And that's just going to go in there like that, plus the 2 egg yolks. And then I'm just going to whiz that round until it should form almost like breadcrumb texture. Okay, that probably was rather too much mixture in there to reasonably expect this poor little food processor to handle, but it did it in the end. It might have been better to do that in 2 batches of half this size. Anyway, in fact, what I think I will do, I might just decant some of this out and bring it together as a dough in 2 smaller batches. Yeah, that seems a more sensible amount. So, with the lid on but the little spout out, I'm going to drizzle in some of this saffron solution with the motor on, just until it comes together into kind of shaggy chunks, which I can bring together into a dough. Right, let's have a look at that. So I can press that together into a dough with my fingers now. I don't know, it might need just a tiny bit more. Now saffron isn't included in the recipe that we looked at earlier, but it is an ingredient that they would have had. Would have been quite expensive, as it still is today, but it's not out of keeping with this recipe. Right, as you saw, I added a little bit more just plain water there, and it's really a case of just adding just enough until it starts to come together into these kind of shaggy lumps of dough, which we will be able to press together into an actual pastry. It's a really short pastry, it's got a lot of fat in it, which also means it's going to be quite delicate to handle. But hopefully when it's cooked, it's going to be nice and crumbly. Now, those 2 batches of pastry are going to come back together. Just get the bits off the blade. And I'll just give those a little mix around just to even out any slight inconsistency in the 2 batches. I can't tell them apart, so I think we're okay. And then that we should be able to press together into a single ball of dough now. It's a big batch of pastry, but then it was a big batch of mincemeat, so I could have halved this recipe, and I think I would still have made more than 6 minced pies of indifferent bigness, whatever indifferent bigness really means. So I am actually kneading this dough a little bit, which will develop the gluten a tiny bit. Ideally, a sweet crust needs to be delicate and crumbly, and so you shouldn't work the dough too much. But these are mince pies that have got to last. They've got to stand, and you don't want them falling apart when you pick them up or crumbling during storage. So I am kneading this dough a little bit more than I might normally for a short crust, which will make it a slightly tougher pastry, but I think it needs to be that little bit tougher just to stand up to the anticipated usage. Right, there we go. So that's come together as a nice ball of dough. I'm going to cover that up, put it in the fridge for about probably an hour, and just let that rest. My pastry's been resting for a while, so it's nice and firm. Hopefully it will be a bit more workable as well now. Thinking about the tins I've got to bake these in. So traditionally, pies like this would not be baked in tins with cavities in them. They'd be hand raised. So that would be a case of taking a ball of pastry and making essentially a pinch pot out of the pastry, putting a ball of filling into the middle, and then closing it with another disc of pastry to make a freestanding pie. Not quite brave enough to try that myself today, but I am going to make them somewhat freestanding, so they're going to stand up inside these cavities, I think, a little bit. We've got to divide this into 21, because that's the number of things I've got. So essentially 12 and 9. So thinking about what that's going to look like, that's going to be about, well, not exactly half then, is it? So we'll do the 9 first. So dividing this piece of pastry into 9 pieces, well, 8 would be doing it in the middle, so we'll go for that, 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 and that. There we go, 9 more or less equal portions of pastry. A little bit of flour. And then each one of these portions of pastry is now going to go into 2/3 and 1/3. That's going to be the lid of the pie. That's going to be the base. And so the base piece I'll roll into a nice round ball, and then on a floured surface flatten it out, and then we'll roll it nice and flat. So roll it into a good circle or something thereabouts. Something like that. And then an ice cream scoop seems about the appropriate amount of filling we're going to put in there. So a portion of filling, something like that. And what I'll do is I'll just form that crust around the filling like so. It will have some little puckers in the pastry, but let's not worry too much about that. That piece of dough there is going to be our lid. And that's going to go on the top. But first, we've got to put some dates in there. Not ever so sure why this recipe specifies that the dates have to go on right at the end, but there they are. I'll put a couple of little slices of date on there like that, and then just with a wetted finger, just going to wet round that pastry, wet around the perimeter of this lid, and join the two. And I think we'll just do a little pinched crimp all the way around. Now there is no expansion room there for those pies, so I might need to think about that. But I think what I'll do is then shape this into a more of a pie shape. That looks pretty good to me. And then we'll go round for another little round of crimping. So we're going for a pork pie sort of look, but that's not necessarily inappropriate because, you know, it is a meat pie. And I'm just going to put a little bit of lard on this tray, and then those will sit in there just like that. Hopefully that'll do it. Actually, on further thought, what I'm going to do with these pies is just crimp over the edge of the pastry just inwards with a fork like that. I think that's a bit prettier. There will be a little steam vent in the top, and that's my maybe mince pie. All right, so there's a dozen of my minced pies, looking variously different. That's actually quite hard work to put those together by hand by rolling out individual balls of dough. So the rest of them, which should be 9 now in the other tray, we're going to go for a more modern approach, which is this. I'm going to roll this dough out into a big sheet. And we're going to cut circles and make them a bit more like modern mince pies. And we use the fluted pastry cutter. 1, 2, 9. There we go. A lot quicker. So these then just drop into here. This is slightly more of a modern method. I think that pastry might still be a bit thick, but we'll run with it. And then I'll just press those into the tray like that. These will not be as big as the other ones that I've made previously by hand, but that was a heck of a lot quicker. A little ball of filling in each one. Now, here's the thing, right? So this is weird to us that we're mixing fruit and meat and sweet sugar and spices and meat together. But before French service became the kind of norm in the Western world, which is French service is where basically you have courses. Your meal has courses where you have a starter, perhaps a main course and a dessert. Distinct courses and divided into sweet and savoury. Before all that happened, people used to just put everything on the table and you'd take what you wanted. Very much like some of the banquet scenes you might have seen in films, actually. So, you know, where there's just a massive amount of food on the table and people grabbing whatever they fancied. That would have been the norm. But in addition, and so there would have been sweet and savoury dishes on the table. But in addition to that, there just wasn't the distinction between sweet dishes and savoury dishes that there is today. So the concept of putting meat with fruit would have been just quite normal. And actually, if you think about it, in other cuisines elsewhere in the world, so Moroccan, for example, very, very common to have fruit and nuts and spices together with meat. You know, think of a lamb tagine, perhaps. It might have apricots and hazelnuts and sweet spices and things in it. Anyway, right, that was a fair bit quicker, wasn't it? It's only when French service came along, where meals were separated into separate courses, that we really got into this idea that things were divided into sweet and savoury. That wasn't a thing further back in history. I need to make some lids for these pies now. So just looking, I'll use the other pastry cutter for these, a slightly smaller one, and that will make a disc of pastry that will go on top. So I'll just ball this dough up. Because this is a short crust pastry, it doesn't actually matter too much. If this was a flaky pastry, it wouldn't be a great thing to be reforming it all the time. You'd lose the kind of flakiness of it. But this is a short crust. This is a kind of pie crust, so it doesn't matter so much. So I'll roll that out, and again I need to get 9 of the smaller ones out of this. Which, if I'm right, I think is about there. So let's just have a look. Yeah, we're going to get 9 out of there easy. So a little bit of water around these crusts here. So each one's supposed to have a slice of date on top of it. I'm not really sure what the purpose of that was. It did make me wonder whether this is a preservation thing, because again, if these pies were intended to be stored in a cold larder, it's possible that the idea of topping the meaty bit with dates was, the intent was that the dates would melt, because they're pretty much entirely sugar, and perhaps they would form a bit of a layer on top of the meat. Or, you know, I don't know, maybe we will be able to distinguish some flavour difference between filling and topping in there. Right, so that gets pressed down. Where's my fork? There we go. And then crimp carefully all the way around. And this is quite a full pie, so there's a possibility that this will just burst when it's baked. We'll see. We can but hope. And then a little vent in the top. Okay, the oven is just preheating. I'm going to bake these at 180 Celsius fan for about 30 to 40 minutes. I will probe them just to make sure that they get to a safe temperature inside, because obviously there's raw meat in here. Before they go in though, we're going to give them a little egg wash. And this is just a regular egg. This is not my Burford brown eggs, because they'd be very, very yellow. And whilst that might be quite pretty on top of the pies, we've got the saffron to hopefully make these pies yellow. Anyway, just going to egg wash the top of the pies like this. This will do two things. It will give them a shiny glaze, but it also tends to protect the pastry from scorching. And so you can cook them a little bit longer with an egg wash on there. It protects the pastry from burning. I do think there's a significant risk these pies are going to explode in the oven, because I just think I might have filled them up a bit too much and not left any expansion room, but we will see. I meant to say, actually, just before this scene here where we're egg washing the pies, I left them in a cold, unheated room, the utility room. I would have put them in the fridge, but there's no room. Just for half an hour to allow the pastry to firm up. And hopefully that will help them to hold their shape until they start to crisp up in the oven. If there's any egg left over at the end of this, Eva's going to get a little omelette for lunch. It did occur to me, by the way, actually, that we're probably pronouncing Eva's name wrong. She's from Portugal. We adopted Eva Doggo from Portugal, and she was named by the people who found her and rescued her out in Portugal. So probably really and truly Eva's name is Eva. Maybe that's why she doesn't come when she's called. Right, anyway, that lot's going to go in the oven now. I'll put the smaller ones on the lower shelf. Not that it'll make a huge amount of difference because it's a fan oven. But anyway, these two are going to go in the oven now for 30 to 40 minutes. All right. These have both had now 35 minutes. These have bubbled and exploded everywhere. That's kind of to be expected. I have a feeling the smaller ones might be done. The bigger ones might need just another 5 minutes or so. We're going to probe them. The safe temperature for lamb is 63 degrees Celsius. That's the safe minimum. But we're way above that. We're up to 90 plus inside of these pies. I'll just check they're all like that. 94 for that one. I suppose the middle one's the one that gets the least cooking, but yeah, up to, there's nearly 100 degrees there. These big ones, I think they might need a little bit longer just for the pastry, but let's probe, see what we got on the inside. 87, 90, 91, 92. So we're already well out of the danger zone for the meat that's in these pies. The meat is now definitely cooked. But I think the bigger ones need to go in for about another 5 to 10 minutes just to crisp up a bit more. After just about 2 minutes cooling, just enough that I can almost touch that pan safely. I'm going to go around these with just a table knife and see if I can loosen them from the tray, because I have a feeling that if I leave these in there, because of all this sticky stuff that's come out, I think they're going to weld themselves into the tray quite inseparably. So round the edge like that with a table knife, and they come out in one piece. They are very hot. I'm actually rather pleased that they didn't explode completely and fall apart. I think I was a little bit pessimistic about how well these were or were not going to hold together, but they seem to have held up okay. I should probably say what they smell like at this point. They smell like mince pies. They don't smell like they've got meat in them, but there's a lot of things in there apart from the meat. Obviously there's all of those spices, quite a lot of cloves actually. I have no complaints about how those have turned out. They are at the moment still very fragile, so I'm handling with great care. Okay, and that's the big ones. Now, as you can see, they are still boiling inside. Not even going to try to touch those until they've stood for maybe 5 minutes. 5 minutes will not cool them down sufficiently to taste or anything like that, but 5 minutes will hopefully reduce the risk of that fruity napalm squirting out on my skin. Right, let's see if these will come out now. So same deal as with the others. I'm just going to try to run the knife around the inside of the tin. Not quite so easy because these have spread a little bit, but no, that's coming off. We could be in trouble here. Let's just try a different one. Maybe I should have stood these up just on a tray, on a flat tray. The main problem is that the filling has just leaked out enough to glue the pies to the tray. That was not a clean removal. Oh, I think that could be good. Let's see if a spoon will get under there. Yeah, well, that kind of worked. Right, going to leave these alone for half an hour at least until they cool down, and hopefully the pastry might firm up enough to handle and they might come out a bit more easily, or they might be stuck there forever. Okay, well, there they are. These have cooled down now sufficiently to be able to taste them. The big ones really didn't come out of the tray all that well. I was surprised at how much they stuck, considering I did grease the trays with lard. The small ones I think did all right. Let's give one of these a taste. They've been cooling about an hour, so they're probably still slightly warm inside. So here we go. They're really rather good. I would not. If you handed me that and said what's different about this mince pie, I would not guess that there's meat in there. It's really strange. I'm going to cut the big one in half so we can get a nice cross section, or hopefully get a nice cross section, and see what they look like inside. So there we go. So I would say they look a bit more meaty than a standard mince pie. Normally it's a lot more sort of syrupy looking. So these have got the look of maybe cooked mince or something to them. But the flavour, I mean, the thing is, there's so much dried fruit, spices, citrus zest. Are you going to taste meat against that? Let's have another little taste and I'll see if I can pick out some flavours. Okay, firstly, the crust is really sweet. Pastry is a very, very sweet, very crumbly pastry. It's very nice. Lard does make for a very crumbly, crisp pastry. The filling is really tender, not as syrupy and moist as the modern mince pie, but not really dry in any way. The prominent flavour is the spices, I think, probably the cloves. It's very bizarre that I can't really sense meat in there. I can't even really feel the texture of meat in there, actually, as I'm chewing it. And I think that's just because that lamb had essentially been marinated in all of those spices and fruits and whatnot. And so it's cooked incredibly tender. There is a kind of rich slightly savouriness to it, I suppose, which could be the meat. Yeah, there is a background richness to these, which I think is the lamb and the fat from the lamb as well. But yeah, they don't taste meaty as such. They just taste, well, they taste quite similar to modern mince pies. And I suppose here's the thing, that if the meat was not that conspicuous of flavour, there's a possible explanation for why it gradually dwindled away to nothing in modern mincemeat, because meat's an expensive ingredient, and so it must have been quite easy to just include less and less of it over time without really much affecting the aesthetics of the finished product. I'm glad I put the figs in there because I do actually enjoy that microscopic crisp crunch that you get from the seeds of dried figs. I'm just going to try a bit of the filling completely on its own from the pie, just to see if there's any difference in the aesthetics. It's definitely drier than modern mincemeat, and it is definitely different, but it's not immediately obvious that that difference is meat. Well, I found that really enjoyable. I'm not sure that I'm going to make these again exactly like that, because that was a big old faff to make. So whilst this was an interesting experiment, and I'm glad to have done it, it's not so remarkably different that I think I'd bother doing it to this degree of difficulty again in the future. But there we go, mince pies with actual minced meat in them. Thanks for watching, and I hope you join me again tomorrow, Christmas Day, for the last door in the Advent calendar.